The gavel had barely touched wood when the air in the room shifted. Cameras whirred, pens poised above notepads, eyes locked forward. And then it came. Judge Joe Brown's voice, a booming thunderclap that rattled the courtroom walls. He wasn't just speaking. He was shouting, his words soaked with condescension, sharpened like arrows meant to pierce dignity. "Congresswoman Crockett," he barked, "you don't know what you're talking about. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." The tuidiwan sting of his tone cut deeper than the words themselves. It was the way his lip curled in a smirk, the way his chest puffed as if the chamber belonged to him alone. He didn't just want to silence her, he wanted to humiliate her, to remind everyone watching that in his court, his voice was law. Around the room, faces tightened. Some flinched at the aggression, others leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. Reporters' pens scratched faster, knowing this was the headline moment they'd been waiting for. The audience at home, millions glued to live feeds, felt that same sharp intake of breath, the collective tension of witnessing power wielded like a weapon. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move a muscle. She simply locked eyes with him, calm and steady, as if the storm had spent itself before it even reached her. Seconds stretched into eternity. The silence she held was louder than his shouting, more unsettling than any comeback could have been. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing something electric in the stillness. Judge Brown chuckled, low and dismissive, convinced he had reduced her to nothing more than another silenced challenger. His arrogance filled the space, feeding off the cameras, feeding off himself. But beneath that silence, something else was building. A shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. The crowd sensed it. Even Brown, in the brief flicker of uncertainty across his eyes, sensed it. And when Jasmine finally opened her mouth, the courtroom and the country would never forget what came next. Because no one expected the calm, devastating words that came out of her mouth next. What unfolded in that chamber was bigger than one outburst, bigger than one clash of egos. To the casual viewer, it might have looked like just another heated exchange, another politician being scolded by a loud, overbearing judge. But beneath the surface, the stakes were enormous. This wasn't simply about a raised voice, it was about who gets to define truth, who gets to hold power, and who is forced into silence. For years, Judge Joe Brown had worn his authority like armor. He thrived on volume, on spectacle, on making challengers look small in the shadow of his booming rhetoric. He wasn't just a judge, he was a showman, a man who had built a career on commanding every room he entered. His legacy was lined with moments of dominance, sound bites clipped and shared as proof of his control. To him, shouting down Jasmine Crockett was just another performance, another notch in a long record of putting others in their place. But what he hadn't anticipated was that this time, the stage had shifted. The cameras weren't just recording his words, they were recording hers. And unlike countless others who had wilted under his bluster, Crockett wasn't playing by his script. This confrontation struck at the heart of something far deeper than a legal proceeding. It was a cultural moment, a mirror held up to America itself. Viewers watching at home saw more than a man trying to silence a woman. They saw history repeating itself. They saw every teacher who had dismissed their voices, every boss who had spoken over them, every institution that had told them to stay in their lane. And in Crockett's silence, in her composure, they saw a promise that this time, things would not end the same way. The tension thickened with every second she remained calm. Social media timelines lit up in real time. Hashtags began to spark. See Crockett Clapback, use calm vs chaos. People were already choosing sides, already framing the moment as something that would live far beyond the courtroom, and that was the true weight of it. This wasn't a private clash, it was public theater, a national referendum on dignity versus arrogance. Millions were watching waiting to see whether power would once again go unchecked, or whether someone would finally stand their ground without raising their voice. The irony was palpable. Joe Brown thought the cameras were his allies, capturing his dominance. But in reality, they were his undoing. Every sneer, every raised eyebrow, every smug laugh only amplified the villainy of his role in this unfolding drama. And every second, Jasmine Crockett sat poised and silent. She transformed from just another name on the docket into something larger, a symbol, a representative of everyone who had ever been shouted down but refused to be broken. The stakes weren't just about her reputation. They were about the story America would tell itself after the gavel finally fell. Would it be another tale of arrogance triumphing, or would it become a rare moment when dignity outlasted fury? The audience in the room could feel the scale of it. Journalists shifted in their seats. Viewers at home leaned closer. The question wasn't whether something would happen. It was when and how devastating it would be. Because Jasmine Crockett was about to speak. And what came out of her mouth next wouldn't just challenge Judge Brown, it would change the narrative of the entire night. But before that moment could arrive, the world needed to understand exactly who Joe Brown was and why his downfall would be so satisfying. To understand the electricity in that chamber, you first have to understand the man who filled it with noise. Judge Joe Brown was never just a judge, he was a performance. From the earliest days of his career, he leaned into a persona. The booming voice, the cutting remarks, the sharp-edged charisma that made him larger than life. To some, he was a champion of old-school truth-telling, the kind of figure who called it like he saw it. To others, he was a bully in robes, a man who mistook volume for wisdom and belittlement for justice. Brown's rise had always been paved with contradictions. He claimed to stand for fairness, yet his record often tilted toward spectacle. He spoke of respect, yet carried himself with a swagger that made it clear respect, in his world, was a one-way street. And for decades, people let him get away with it. In the age before viral clips and trending hashtags, his dominance went largely unchecked. Courtrooms weren't theaters for the world back then. They were confined spaces where his authority loomed absolute. Litigants who dared to challenge him often found themselves on the receiving end of his trademark tirades. To the system, he was efficient. To those beneath his gavel, he was terrifying. But the very arrogance that had once cemented his reputation became his Achilles heel in a new era. The camera is an unforgiving witness. It doesn't just capture words, it captures intent. The raised brow, the smirk, the dismissive wave of a hand, all of it becomes magnified when millions can pause, replay, and dissect every frame. By the time Joe Brown faced Jasmine Crockett, he was no longer the untouchable titan of the bench. He was a relic of a style America was growing weary of, a style rooted in dominance, intimidation, and a refusal to adapt. Yet in his own mind, he was still the towering figure he had always been. That self-perception, that blindness to change, was the very thing that made the confrontation inevitable. Brown carried the aura of a man who believed he was untouchable. His legacy, his years of authority, gave him the confidence to treat every opponent the same way, as a challenger to be swatted down, not as an equal to be engaged. In his world, a raised voice was the ultimate argument, and silence from the other side was always submission. But that formula failed when it met someone like Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't rattled by noise. She wasn't intimidated by arrogance. And most of all, she understood something Brown didn't. In the world of politics, law, and media, optics are everything. The public had long grown skeptical of men who mistook cruelty for strength. The culture was shifting, and figures like Brown, who once thrived in the absence of accountability, were now subject to the unrelenting judgment of millions watching from their phones. Every taunt became a meme. Every sneer became a viral, still shot. His very style, once his greatest weapon, was now the rope he was hanging himself with. And yet, he couldn't stop. The arrogance ran too deep, like a reflex he couldn't control. That's why he shouted at Crockett the way he did. Not because it was strategic, not because it was wise, but because it was all he knew. That moment, the booming voice echoing across the chamber, was the culmination of decades of unchecked power. It was the expression of a man who had always believed he could bend the world to his will simply by raising his tone. And for a heartbeat, he believed it would work again. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest mind. Brown didn't see the shift happening around him. He didn't see how the cameras, the audience, and the nation itself were no longer leaning into his act. They were waiting for someone to break the pattern, to stand up without shouting back, to show that strength can exist in silence. And that's why his downfall was so inevitable. He wasn't just battling Jasmine Crockett, he was battling the era itself. He was the embodiment of an old way of doing things, where might made right, where the loudest voice always won. And the moment Crockett refused to play his game, his power began to crumble before the nation's eyes. To understand Joe Brown's story is to understand the tragedy of arrogance. A man who had every opportunity to adapt, to soften, to meet a new generation with respect, yet chose instead to double down on his own theatrics. And when the curtain finally lifted on this latest performance, he didn't realize that the world wasn't applauding anymore. The villain of this drama wasn't born in a single moment. He was forged through years of unchecked behavior, through applause that encouraged the worst parts of his persona, through a system that mistook intimidation for authority. But all villains eventually meet their reckoning. And for Joe Brown, that reckoning stood calmly before him, ready to turn his own style against him without raising her voice. The question that remained was not whether he would fall, but how spectacularly. And to answer that, we must look at the woman who sat across from him, Jasmine Crockett, the unlikely hero whose story made her the perfect counterbalance to a man like Joe Brown. To understand why Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, why she sat calmly in the eye of Joe Brown's storm, you have to know the road she traveled to get there. Hers is not the story of privilege or entitlement. It is the story of a woman forged in struggle, sharpened by service and lifted by the belief that dignity is a greater weapon than rage. Jasmine Crockett's journey began far from the bright lights of national attention. Born into a working-class family, she learned early that silence was never an option when justice was on the line. Around the kitchen table, conversations weren't about abstract theories. They were about lived reality, neighbors fighting eviction, friends struggling with discrimination, communities overlooked by those in power. In those moments, a young Jasmine absorbed a truth that would guide her entire career. The law was not just words on paper, it was power. And if wielded wrong, it could crush lives. College and law school weren't easy roads. Crockett didn't arrive cloaked in generational wealth or family connections. She carried herself through sheer determination, often balancing jobs with classes, pouring herself into late-night study sessions because she knew the stakes were bigger than her own ambition. For her, a degree wasn't just a milestone, it was armor, the kind she could use to protect the vulnerable and challenge the arrogant. But what truly defined Jasmine Crockett wasn't just her education, it was the way she chose to use it. She could have taken the comfortable path, seeking prestige in high-paying firms where cases are measured in billable hours, not in lives impacted. Instead, she went where the fight was rawest, defending those without voices, stepping into courtrooms where the scales were already tipped, representing people who had long since given up on fairness. This choice shaped her reputation. Crockett wasn't the kind of lawyer who relied on theatrics. She didn't need to raise her voice because her preparation was her power. Every document, every precedent, every carefully constructed argument was a brick in the wall she built to shield her clients. While others tried to bulldoze with intimidation, She disarmed with precision. Her path into politics was almost inevitable. When you fight in the trenches long enough, you begin to see the larger patterns, the laws designed to fail the vulnerable, the loopholes crafted for the powerful. Crockett stepped into public office not as a career move, but as a continuation of the same fight she had waged her entire life. She wasn't just representing constituents, she was representing her younger self, her family, and every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. And this is where the contrast with Joe Brown becomes so striking. Brown's authority was inherited from the system, a robe, a bench, and decades of unchallenged dominance. Crockett's authority was earned piece by piece through battles that tested her resilience. He wielded arrogance. She wielded dignity. He leaned on bluster. She leaned on facts. By the time their paths collided, Crockett had already built a reputation for being unflinching in the face of disrespect. She had dealt with sneers, dismissals, and the quiet, patronizing tones of those who assumed she didn't belong at the table. Every encounter only sharpened her resolve. Each insult became a lesson. Don't respond with anger, respond with clarity. Don't lower yourself to their game. Elevate the standard so high they cannot reach it. That's why, when Joe Brown shouted across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett didn't shrink back. She had already faced men like him before, men who believed. Their volume was victory, who mistook aggression for intelligence. But she had also learned something essential. The louder they yell, the weaker their position. And so, in that moment, her calm was not just composure, it was a strategy. But her story isn't just about resilience, it's about identity. Crockett has always embraced the fullness of who she is. A black woman, a lawyer, a servant leader, and a fighter for communities too often ignored. She didn't run from her identity. She wore it as a badge, knowing that every step forward she took would open the door wider for those who came after. In every courtroom, in every chamber, she carried more than her own reputation. She carried the weight of representation. This is why millions watching didn't just see a politician when Crockett faced off against Brown. They saw themselves. They saw their mothers, their daughters, their communities standing tall against the arrogance of entrenched power. They saw the possibility of dignity triumphing over condescension. And they saw, in her measured gaze and poised response, the truth that strength doesn't always shout. It sometimes whispers and still commands the room. Her backstory makes that moment of confrontation more than just a clash of personalities. It becomes symbolic. Brown represented the old guard, brash, dismissive, domineering. Crockett embodied the new era, resilient, fact-driven, rooted in justice. It wasn't just about two individuals in a heated exchange. It was about the very direction of America's future. And so, as she sat there, unshaken while the echoes of Brown's booming voice rattled the chamber, Crockett carried not only her own history, but the hopes of a generation that believed in something greater. She wasn't simply responding to a man's arrogance. She was responding to decades of a culture that told people like her to know their place. Her calm wasn't just calm. It was defiance. Her silence before she spoke wasn't empty. It was power gathering itself, preparing for the words that would shift the entire atmosphere. Because when Jasmine Crockett finally did answer Joe Brown, it wasn't just another lawyer's reply. It was the voice of a movement, sharpened by history, anchored in dignity, and ready to turn arrogance into its own undoing. And that's exactly what happened next. The chamber was no longer a place of quiet discourse. It had become an arena. Joe Brown, his voice thundering as though sheer volume could bend truth to his will, loomed over the moment. His words weren't just arguments, they were jabs, crafted to belittle, to rattle, to remind everyone watching of the power he thought he still held. He accused, he mocked, he framed himself as the authority beyond challenge. Each syllable dripped with condescension, and each insult carried the weight of decades in which voices like his had gone unopposed. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes followed him steadily, never breaking, never lowering. Every raised. Voice, every finger pointed in her direction only underscored the imbalance of their confrontation. One man clinging to bluster, and one woman grounded in unshakable poise. The room felt the shift, though the shouting continued. Something was about to break, and it would not be her. The escalation took shape like a duel. Brown leaned harder into his strategy, personal attacks, questioning her experience, her legitimacy, even her very right to stand opposite him. It was arrogance masquerading as authority. He struck with insinuations designed to sting, that she was too young, too radical, too emotional. He wanted the cameras to catch her cracking, to capture a moment of weakness that could be replayed endlessly. Instead, the cameras captured stillness. Crockett's stillness. She took notes as he raged, jotting down his contradictions, his slips of logic, the cracks in his argument that only widened with every angry word. To those watching, her calm became its own form of resistance, a contrast so sharp it turned his fury into a spectacle. The tension in the room thickened. Spectators whispered. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some leaned forward in anticipation, waiting for Crockett to finally fire back. Others shook their heads at Brown's display, embarrassed by the raw desperation hidden beneath his booming tone. And through it all, Crockett remained the center of gravity, unmoved, unyielding, quietly building the storm that was about to unleash. Brown, sensing that his theatrics weren't landing, raised the stakes. He slammed the desk. He pointed directly at her. He declared with absolute confidence that she would regret challenging him. The arrogance of the statement hung in the air. It was not just an argument anymore. It was a declaration of dominance, a claim that history would side with him. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett finally lifted her pen from the paper, set it down, and leaned forward. The cameras zoomed in. The chatter hushed. The chamber's energy shifted as if everyone understood that the silence before her words carried more weight than the volume of his entire tirade. Her gaze locked on him, steady as steel. "Are you finished?" she asked, not with hostility, not with weakness, but with a calm that sliced sharper than any insult. The line was simple, but it landed with devastating effect. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Brown faltered, momentarily caught off guard by the audacity of her composure. What came next would change the entire tone of the debate. She wasn't going to match his volume. She wasn't going to mirror his aggression. She was going to dismantle him piece by piece, and she was going to do it so thoroughly that his shouting would sound like the hollow echo of a man already defeated. The room could feel it. The viewers watching at home could feel it. Social media, already buzzing, was about to explode. Because everyone knew. Joe Brown had been loud, but Jasmine Crockett was about to be unforgettable, and what she said next would not only silence him, but ignite a fire far beyond those walls. The silence that followed her question, "Are you finished?" was not the kind of silence that came from calm. It was the silence of thousands holding their breath at once, both in the chamber and beyond. A silence that magnified every flicker of expression on Joe Brown's face, every bead of sweat on his brow, every twitch of discomfort as the weight of her words settled and Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. That was the brilliance of her counterattack. She let the silence breathe, let it stretch, let the cameras capture Brown in all his puffed-up arrogance now suddenly robbed of momentum. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, steady. It was the sound of someone who didn't need to shout because the truth was already louder than any insult he could throw. "Judge Brown," she began, every syllable crisp. "What you've mistaken for inexperience is preparation. What you've mistaken for weakness is patience. And what you've mistaken for silence is the kind of discipline that exposes exactly what you've just shown the world." Gasps again. The audience could feel it. The knife turning. She wasn't just defending herself. She was reframing the entire exchange. Brown's shouting now looked like desperation. Her calm became authority. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the very picture of composure. For the last 10 minutes you've spoken about me, my age, my character, my supposed lack of worth. But you've given this room not a single fact. Not one. And that, Judge, is the difference between performance and truth. The words landed. Like body blows. Each statement a direct contrast to his bluster, each delivered without raising her voice. Crockett didn't need theatrics. She had the receipts, and then she produced them. From her folder she pulled a stack of documents, dates, rulings, quotes from Brown's past that contradicted everything he had just claimed. She laid them on the desk, one by one, like evidence, in a courtroom drama. The cameras zoomed in, reporters craned their necks. Social media hashtags began to surge as screenshots and clips flooded out in real time. You said you stand for fairness, she continued, her voice gaining just a hint of sharpness. Yet, in 2003, you ruled against workers' protections despite overwhelming evidence of corporate abuse. In 2011, you dismissed a case of racial discrimination as overblown rhetoric. And just last year, you questioned whether women in positions of power could handle the heat. She paused, letting the weight of each contradiction sink in. That's not fairness. That's bias, plain and simple. And today, your behavior is proving it once again. Brown shifted uneasily, his earlier confidence cracking. He tried to interject, but Crockett raised her hand. Not aggressively, but firmly enough to reclaim the floor. No, sir, you've had your turn. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Some clapped quietly, others whispered, but the shift was undeniable. The power had tilted. Crockett pressed on. You want to talk about emotion? Let's talk about the emotion you've shown here today. Shouting, insulting, dismissing. That's not the strength of a leader. It's the insecurity of a man afraid of accountability. The room buzzed. Viewers across the country typed furiously. She said it. She called it out. Clips of that single line were already being clipped, subtitled, memed, but she wasn't done. Her voice grew more resolute. And here's the truth you can't shout over. Dignity is not weakness. Restraint is not cowardice. And respect is not something to be handed out by men who mistake arrogance for authority. Respect is earned. And right now, this chamber, this country, and every person watching has seen the difference between bluster and backbone. It was the mic drop moment. Cameras flashed, the room stirred, and Brown, once towering, booming, invincible, looked suddenly small. He leaned back, searching for words, but every attempt sputtered under the weight of her precision. For the first time, he wasn't dictating the tempo. He was reacting, cornered by her evidence, her composure, her devastating ability to turn his own strategy against him. And Crockett delivered the final cut, not with venom, but with the calm finality of truth. So, yes, Judge, you can laugh. You can shout. You can try to make a spectacle. But at the end of the day, facts remain facts. And dignity doesn't just endure mockery. It outlasts it. Today, America has seen the proof. The silence that followed was deafening, then applause. First from a few scattered voices, then swelling, filling the chamber despite protocol. Reporters scribbled, cameras panned, and across the country, viewers felt a surge of validation. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been belittled, dismissed, or talked over. Jasmine Crockett had become their voice in that chamber. And Brown. He sat there, visibly shaken, lips pressed tight, the image of a man who had shouted as loud as he could, only to realize volume could never overpower truth. The chamber would never forget what it had just witnessed. And the country was already buzzing with a question. How far would the shockwaves of this moment travel? Because if a single woman's calm could topple decades of arrogance in one exchange, what else could it ignite? The roar of applause inside the chamber hadn't even died down before the moment broke loose into the wider world. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The hashtags lit up like wildfire. Mic drop Crockett. Truth over shouts. Respect earned. One clip in particular. Crockett leaning forward, eyes fixed, voice steady as she declared, "Respect is earned." And right now, this country has seen the difference between bluster and backbone. Exploded across feeds. Millions watched, rewatched, and shared. Comment sections overflowed with fire emojis, applause gifs, and a chorus of validation. She said what we've all been thinking. That's how you handle a bully. This is leadership. Even mainstream outlets couldn't ignore it. By the evening news cycle, headlines blared across screens. Crockett shatters Brown in live clash. Calm dignity crushes courtroom shouting match. Social media crowns new hero in viral showdown. The framing was clear. Joe Brown had barked, but Jasmine Crockett had bitten back with facts, dignity, and an unshakable calm that resonated far beyond the room. And the ripple effects didn't stop with journalists. Celebrities weighed in. Athletes, actors, and musicians reposted the clip with captions like, "This is what courage looks like," or "A queen handling her business." Activists connected it to bigger struggles, tweeting, "Every immigrant, every woman, every person of color who's ever been talked over, this moment was for us." The narrative was no longer about just one courtroom clash. It had become a cultural flashpoint. Meanwhile, Judge Joe Brown's defenders scrambled. A few attempted to reframe his outburst as passion or old-school toughness, but the internet wasn't buying it. Side-by-side clips circulated, Brown red-faced, shouting, versus Crockett calm, unbothered, dismantling him point by point. The contrast was brutal. Memes mocked him as a relic of arrogance, a symbol of power trying and failing to bully its way through, and then came the late-night shows. Comedians replayed the exchange, pausing after Brown's insults only to cut to Crockett's mic drop. Audiences howled. One host quipped, "Joe Brown came in swinging, but Jasmine Crockett just taught him the first rule of arguments. Don't bring a megaphone to a facts fight." But the most powerful wave wasn't laughter. It was pride. Across immigrant communities, across marginalized groups, people shared their own stories under the hashtag #backbone-like Crockett. A Latina mother wrote, "This reminded me of every time I've been told to be quiet in meetings. Thank you for showing calm is power." A Nigerian student tweeted, "Seeing her stand tall makes me believe we all can." The clip had become not just viral content, but a mirror, reflecting people's frustrations, their dignity, their hunger for representation. Even political figures chimed in. Some progressive leaders hailed Crockett's composure as an example of true statesmanship. Others contrasted it with Brown's embarrassing display, warning that America had no place for leaders who confuse bullying with authority. The clash had crystallized a larger national conversation, the battle between outdated arrogance and a new generation of leaders rooted in truth and dignity. And through it all, Crockett remained composed. In a brief statement afterward, she didn't gloat or escalate. She simply said, "I stood up for myself the way I stand up for my community, with dignity, with facts. That's what leadership demands." The restraint only amplified her power, because where Brown had overreached, Crockett stayed grounded. Where he had sought to dominate, she had chosen to demonstrate. The public could feel the difference. By the following morning, polls and comment sections told the story. Crockett had won not just the moment, but the narrative. And Judge Brown. He was left to reckon with a legacy now indelibly stamped with one viral truth. That volume without substance collapses under the weight of quiet strength. But as the nation scrolled, shared, and debated, a deeper question began to stir. If 1. Viral exchange could capture America's imagination like this, what would happen when moments like it multiplied? What would happen when more voices, armed with truth and composure, refused to be silenced by arrogance? The chamber had witnessed a takedown. The internet had witnessed a cultural earthquake. But America was only beginning to grapple with the aftershocks, and what came next would test whether Crockett's words would live as a viral clip or ignite a movement. The headlines, the memes, the late-night monologues, those would eventually fade. But what lingered, what echoed long after the cameras stopped rolling, was something deeper. This clash wasn't just about a shouting judge and a calm congresswoman. It was about what kind of America people wanted to live in. Joe Brown's tirade had embodied an old script. Arrogance mistaking itself for authority, volume pretending to be wisdom, power assuming it could silence dignity. It was the script so many had endured in classrooms, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, an echo of every time someone with less power was told to stay quiet, to sit down, to accept their place. But Jasmine Crockett rewrote that script in real time. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't meet insult with insult. She didn't play the game on Brown's terms. Instead, she held her ground with dignity, with clarity, with an unshakable sense of self. And in doing so, she proved a truth. As old as democracy itself, arrogance crumbles when confronted with composure. For many watching, it wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. It was a reminder that calm strength doesn't mean weakness. It means control. It means refusing to let someone else define the terms of your worth. It means knowing that dignity, wielded correctly, can be sharper than any insult. And there was something distinctly American in it. The immigrant mother who works 2 jobs yet still carries herself with pride. The young activist who speaks up at City Hall, even when dismissed. The student who refuses to let an accent or a last name be a ceiling. Crockett's moment belonged to them too. It was a reminder that the fight for respect doesn't always come with fireworks. It comes with steady courage, with choosing to respond, not react. Even critics were forced to acknowledge it. Commentators who rarely praised her admitted that she had handled herself with rare discipline. Opponents tried to spin it as theatrics but couldn't escape the resonance. Because beneath the clash of words, people recognized something timeless. Leadership isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing tallest when the room shakes, and in that chamber, Crockett stood tallest. The lesson radiated beyond politics. Parents shared the clip with their kids, framing it as a lesson in self-respect. Teachers used it in classrooms to illustrate composure under pressure. Faith leaders quoted it in sermons about humility, triumphing over pride. The moment had transcended politics. It had become parable. Yet, the most striking part was Crockett herself. She didn't gloat. She didn't claim victory. She simply returned to her work, grounded, unfazed, clear-eyed. That restraint underscored the moral of it all. True strength doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself when tested. And so the story settled into the nation's memory, not just as a viral clip, not just as a clapback, but as a cultural checkpoint. A reminder that every time arrogance tries to shout us down, there is another choice, a better choice. To stand in dignity, to answer with truth, to let composure carry the day. The world will always have its Joe Browns, loud, certain, convinced that bluster equals strength. But the world also has its Jasmine Crocketts, leaders who don't just speak truth to power, they expose power for what it is when it lacks truth. And in that clash, America was reminded of something vital. Dignity isn't just defense. It's a weapon, and when wielded calmly, it is unbeatable. Which leaves one final question. If one moment of calm could shift a courtroom, a headline, a nation's conversation. What could happen if millions chose dignity over arrogance every day? The answer, perhaps, is the America we are still waiting to build. But one viral moment showed us the blueprint, and it all started with a judge who shouted and a congresswoman who refused to be moved. Judge Joe Brown shouted. Cameras caught every syllable, every sneer, every ounce of arrogance as he tried to dominate the room. But when history looks back, it won't remember the volume of his voice. It will remember the composure of Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't falter. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Instead, with calm words that cut sharper than any insult, she flipped the script. The courtroom that began with arrogance ended with dignity. And across America, millions felt the ripple. That's the heart of this story. Arrogance can fill a room for a moment, but dignity echoes far longer. It inspires, it teaches, it reminds us that true leadership isn't about overpowering others. It's about standing tall when others try to drag you down. And that's why this moment matters. It isn't just about one clash between a judge and a congresswoman. It's about every classroom where a student refuses to be silenced. Every workplace where someone insists on being treated with respect. Every immigrant, every activist, every dreamer who knows that composure, patience, and truth carry more weight than any insult hurled their way. That's why we tell these stories. Because they aren't just entertainment. They're lessons. They're blueprints for how to face arrogance in our own lives. So if you believe that dignity beats arrogance, if you believe that truth deserves to be louder than hate, if you believe that moments like this should never be silenced, then this is your movement too. Subscribe. Share this story. Join a community that refuses to be shouted down. Together, we can make sure these moments don't fade. They grow, because arrogance may shout for a moment, but dignity lasts forever.